Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, June 17th, 2025, and today we are going to be taking a look at a 2028 presidential election prediction between Secretary Pete Buttigieg, who recently served in the Biden administration as the Secretary of the Department of Transportation, and Vice President J.D. Vance, who is the incumbent Vice President, in a hypothetical 2028 matchup. Now, two very, very strong contenders on their respective party sides in their party primaries, both of which seem to be leading the bunch, taking out Vice President Kamala Harris from consideration for the 2028 race. Pete Buttigieg stands to be the runner-up right now and the front-runner with taking her out of the equation, and J.D. Vance, who stands to be the front-runner on the Republican side. I thought it would be time to take a look at a hypothetical matchup between the two candidates, what it would look like with Pete Buttigieg against J.D. Vance in a 2028 race, because honestly speaking, I am also quite interested in what this matchup might look like. Now, the 2024 election was nothing short of a defeat for the Democratic Party in a number of areas that they thought they would do better in than the last presidential election. Granted, the data looked a lot worse for the Democratic Party, but a lot of questions have been raised about what the future might look like in Democratic strategy sessions about how they could actually win back presidential control in the next election. And a lot of people have been thinking that it isn't just down to simple party dynamics in swing states, in the Rust Belt, in the Sun Belt, but also down to candidate quality. After all, Donald Trump, who many people thought would be a weaker nominee in 2024, ended up being stronger than his 2020 counterpart of himself in the last presidential election. And looking ahead to 2028, the very easy answer here on the Democratic side would be to run a candidate that they believe can win in the general election. So, about 3 years out, as I did in 2017, arguably as I did in 2021, I thought it would be interesting to take a look at what these hypothetical scenarios might look like ahead of the next presidential, given that we're in a bit of a lull period here where we can actually explore some of these more mainstream hypotheticals that might not pan out to reality, but certainly could give us a good indication about where we are today on the electoral map. And so as something that just prefaces where we are right now on the national stage, Donald Trump is the president. His popularity rating is about -4, -5 nationwide. The Democrats lead in the generic ballot by roughly 2 to 3 points, and they are on track to win Democratic control of the House of Representatives in 2026. Republicans are on track to maintain control of the United States Senate. So the 2028 map is largely going to be guided by what we've understood and known, very much so, after the 2024 election, but also to the 2020 election and the 2016 presidential election. Essentially, we've been, talking about a world of American politics that has been dominated by Donald Trump since 10 years ago, and it doesn't look like 2028 will be that different. But what we do know is, coming off the last election, many of the states that might have seen reversals in favor of Donald Trump probably won't be there all too much for J.D. Vance, especially given where we are nationally with Donald Trump's approval. One thing that I think we forget in this analysis of presidential elections is that we haven't had a presidential election without Donald Trump on the ballot since Barack Obama won re-election, which means that looking at, 2012, it's a very different Republican landscape in 2028, and it also means that it is one that is much less predictable in a way that seems quite insane to think about, that it is less predictable with Donald Trump on the ballot, but in many cases it is true. With J.D. Vance on the ballot, I think we're going to start to see some of that reversal in support in a way towards the more traditional aspects of the GOP, things that didn't necessarily lend itself to being that beneficial for somebody like Mitt Romney. When I take a look at how Donald Trump did well in New York City and in New Jersey and in other parts of the country that Mitt Romney arguably just simply did not do well in, you have to ask why. And a big reason for that is because Donald Trump provided a unique appeal specifically to massive swaths of the Democratic Party majority, voting group that sure have still feel estranged from the Democratic Party, won't be as locked in for them the next time around. But Donald Trump had a unique appeal that I don't think necessarily that J.D. Vance offers. I also think, too, that Pete Buttigieg has this type of unique appeal, right? Being able to talk to median and swing voters in the way that many Democrats simply cannot. I do think that Pete Buttigieg, as much as he does not have the strongest electoral history coming from Indiana and not running for office in a battleground state since then, I do think that matters. At the same time, J.D. Vance, who was an underperformer in 2022, didn't add much to the ticket in 2024. I think you're going to start to see that this is where you will find that it is Pete Buttigieg who does bring back in those swaths of Democratic Party voting bases that might not necessarily have been, would have been as tapped in or as in tune to voting for Kamala Harris in the last election. So states like New York and Illinois and Oregon that might have been, likely states, but just on the margins likely states, 13 points, right? Delaware 15 points, Connecticut 14, Rhode Island, Oregon 14 points. going to move over into being states that are pretty safe and locked in for the Democratic Party. So that brings Democrats to about 167 electoral votes that we can consider to be safe, looking at states like Colorado and New Mexico also on the verge there, but we'll take a moment and talk about those in a likely context in just a moment. For J.D. Vance, he also shares a lot of the same states that Donald Trump was able to consider to be safe, at least safe enough that, it's not going to be ones that J.D. Vance or Pete Buttigieg are really contesting to any major degree. When you're taking a look at states like South Carolina and Mississippi and Indiana and Missouri back in 2016 and 2020, there was hope there for Democrats that they might be able to bring it down. Indiana wouldn't budge. Missouri wouldn't budge. South Carolina did, however, but by the time we reach the next election, certainly a much bigger swing. Mississippi didn't budge either. So I don't think that they're going to be budging this time around. The only one I could really see it is Alaska because it wasn't a safe state in the last cycle. So Alaska would probably be out of the fray. The rest of these states, Nebraska at large as well, would be in the safe Republican column. And so that brings us here to about 121 electoral votes for J.D. Vance, 167 for Pete Buttigieg. But we have to characterize the likely states. These are states that we know are going to go anywhere by a margin between 5 to 15 points in favor of the political party that we characterize it for. And honestly speaking, right, J.D. Vance still maintains a lot of that same appeal that Donald Trump has. Is it as strong? I don't think so. Is it as, able to capture in white working class voters while simultaneously, Latino voters that have been longtime voters for the Democratic Party, specifically black men that have seen a slight shift in favor of the GOP, Asian American voters that have seen an abandonment of national Democrats? J.D. Vance can hold on and retain a lot of that base that just simply has moved over, but I do think you're going to see a lot of it really level off, and I do think that Pete Buttigieg, being from the Midwest, and also, too, being someone who is seen as more sensible, more moderate, more middle of the road, that can meet a lot of these voters where they are, I think you're also going to see that Pete Buttigieg does bring in, portions of that electorate that does, on the margins, shave away from where Donald Trump was in the last cycle. And especially when it comes down to, white suburban voters that were actually quite good for Kamala Harris in the last election. Despite the loss, the least amount of shifts we saw came from areas that were predominantly there. You saw it in the Atlanta metro suburbs, but in the Atlanta metro region, right, the actual urban areas, you did see Donald Trump make minor advancements. That is where I think you'll find that Pete Buttigieg does actually shine through, and J.D. Vance does, in fact, see some, losses there. And so I do think that'll still translate, right? J.D. Vance holds on to substantive portions of that electorate, wins Texas by a likely margin, wins Florida by a likely margin, skyrockets his numbers up to 191, will win Alaska, obviously, those 3 electoral votes. I still think, though, right, Buttigieg is going to hold strong. He's going to win Virginia by a likely margin. He's going to move Minnesota back into a likely state. He's going to move New Hampshire back into a likely state. Maine at large, he's going to win. Nebraska's 2nd district, I think he wins by 5 or 6 points. New Jersey, he's certainly winning in, right? Colorado, New Mexico, all states that Democrats would be saying, with the wrong nominee in 2028 could be a lot more competitive than necessary. I think in 2028 with Pete Buttigieg against J.D. Vance, they lock back in for the Democrats and already characterize all the states that Kamala Harris won by a likely margin. Of course, J.D. Vance is going to win that Nebraska 1st district. It's going to be a little bit narrower, but that brings us down to 117 toss-up electoral votes. And so this is where I do think that, J.D. Vance does come in. He wins Ohio. He wins Iowa. I think that Midwestern appeal still exists for J.D. Vance. I don't think it exists to the same extent that it did for Donald Trump. There is a reason that in 2022, when you look at that Senate race, yes, Democrats did invest heavily in it, but there is a reason that Ohio ended up being a 6-point race after Donald Trump won the state by 8 in the last election and then went on to win it by 11 2 years later. There's a reason that J.D. Vance was an underperformer in the Ohio Senate race, and that's because voters largely didn't like him. And when you take a look at the approval rating for J.D. Vance, it's lower than Trump's. Voters don't like him as much. He was the most disliked candidate out of the 4, Tim Walz, Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, himself included, of the 4 in the last cycle, and there is a consistent reason for that. Pete Buttigieg, on the counterpart, has largely avoided a lot of this heavy scrutiny, obviously subject to a lot of the same attacks that Democrats are. He still represents a political party that did lose large swaths of their base in the last cycle, but it doesn't mean that they can't be won back. Counterpoint 2, I don't think Pete Buttigieg is going to be someone who just miraculously saves the minority vote share that Democrats held on to with Clinton and arguably even Biden in 2020. But I do think there would be still some reversal of support that moves back in favor of the Democratic Party. But where I think Pete Buttigieg shines through, and I think a lot of people see this too, is the fact that he does win. Those large chunks of white suburban voters that make up the majority of swing state voting electorates that are necessary to win for Democrats. And what he does there is he wins them over in droves. And not to say that it's not going to be a competitive race, right? This is not going to be some type of easy victory for Democrats with Pete Buttigieg at the top of the ticket or J.D. Vance at the top of the Republican ticket. But what it does do here is that you're going to find that it's that battle between J.D. Vance and Pete Buttigieg, where Pete Buttigieg, I do think, does better than J.D. Vance amongst these voters that are key and crucial, not just to Democratic victories, but Republican victories too. And so I do think Pete Buttigieg, though, in addressing all of what we have to see here on the presidential level, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, I do think that based on the demographics of the states, based on electoral history too in the last cycle, how much they swung relative to other portions of the nation, that will be the prime target for Buttigieg, right? For Team Buttigieg. They'll see that, North Carolina, Georgia, sure, good news for Democrats there, but on the other side of the coast, right? Arizona swung by 6. Nevada swung by 6. Texas by 8. Even states that weren't necessarily, overwhelming in favor of Trump at all, states like California swung by 9, right? So when you think about 2028, you think about this region and you say, yes, compete there. But is that going to be prime real estate for a Buttigieg-J.D. Vance matchup? Probably not. At the same time, J.D. Vance, as the serial underperformer, doesn't do well in the Midwestern region and does not bring in those bastions of voters that were all in for Trump but not in for anybody else. There could very well be a lot of low-propensity voters that just simply don't vote in the next cycle because they only vote when Donald Trump is on the ballot. But that isn't to say that J.D. Vance won't have his own, fair share of states and districts that he can do well in. I think Pete shaves away at that Maine second margin, brings it down to 4 to 5 points in favor of J.D. Vance, but J.D. Vance still wins. I also think, too, looking at a 2028 matchup, the pathway to victory for Pete Buttigieg, again, I think, lies through the Rust Belt region insofar that J.D. Vance is losing those voters that I do think Pete Buttigieg could pick up. I think he would narrowly win in Wisconsin. I think he would narrowly win in Michigan. And I do think he would narrowly win in Pennsylvania. I think those 3 states alone would be enough to put Pete Buttigieg over the top. Just mathematically, that is true. It would bring him to 270 electoral votes, and I think we would find it. That Buttigieg's strength, again, these are wider states compared to the rest of the nation, right? Georgia is majority minority. Arizona is majority minority. Nevada is too. And so when you think about demographic groups, historically speaking, that would have lent itself for Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada based on standard convention with Democrats. We would have said they would do better there. I don't necessarily think that is where Pete Buttigieg's prime appeal is. Now, with the right vice presidential candidate, maybe, right? This has been the age-old question. Back in 2020, when Biden won the nomination, the Democratic Party was pushing this narrative that they were the younger, more progressive, more look like America party, and yet their nominee was an older white man who was a very long entrenched Democratic politician. Joe Biden very clearly was right for the time, was able to meet the moment, and won in 2020. But that was why, when you looked at what Democrats were looking at, saying the messaging isn't exactly adding up here, there will be questions about that later down the line, right? I do think Pete Buttigieg, in many ways, obviously is a younger vision for the Democratic Party. He would be the first gay president in United States history, or maybe openly. Not going to, dive into that one. But, looking at Pete Buttigieg, sure, represents progress. At the same time, his strength and what we saw in the Democratic primary, from a strictly electoral standpoint, his strength in terms of what we saw in terms of connecting with voters and where he was deemed most effective by campaign strategists and surrogates, where was he sent to, right? The Midwestern region, where was he sent to? Areas at which they knew his strength was most powerful. And I do think that would largely be the case because I don't think J.D. Vance is going to outperform Trump in any of these states. I think there might be on the margins some suburban areas that if Pete Buttigieg isn't reaching them as well, especially suburban minority regions, sure, there might be some slight improvement for J.D. Vance for those who want to go back to the day and age of the Mitt Romney style Republican, a more moderate and more centered approach to Republican politics. I still think Pete Buttigieg outflanks him on multiple different fronts. And I think that's why, ultimately, Pete Buttigieg would defeat J.D. Vance in those 3 Rust Belt states, which is categorically enough to win the presidency outright. Now, in the remaining 49 toss-up electoral votes, this is where I do think that the remainder and that residual strength that Donald Trump had in the last cycle would be enough to keep these states intact. I think that Nevada would see a narrow shift not narrow shift, a substantive shift in favor of Democrats, but it still wouldn't be clinchable. I think the same can be said about Arizona, that these two states would be kept within the margin of a point or two, but in favor of J.D. Vance, at least at this point, right? If Donald Trump's approval rating is 10 points worse in a year from now, this map would look very different. But this is under the current context, extrapolating 3 years out, what we could expect based on the data we have right now. J.D. Vance would probably still win Arizona and probably still win Nevada. Now, the other two that I'm interested by that will largely be informed by what we see in 2026, and same can be said for the other states we've characterized, but more so here is because North Carolina and Georgia actually were quite surprising in terms of their lack of shift in the last cycle. Georgia shifted by 2.4, North Carolina by 1.9, arguably speaking, less than almost any other battleground state, save Wisconsin. Michigan swung by 4, Pennsylvania swung by 3, Arizona by 6, and Nevada by 6. Georgia and North Carolina, in a way, despite voting for Trump, were beacons of hope for Democrats in the future. I don't know if Pete Buttigieg is that Democrat to do quite well there. I do think that, when it comes down to who can really rile up and inspire minority support, which is very key and necessary in North Carolina and Georgia, knowing the electoral history of the states, I would think it would be somebody, in theory, right, like Roy Cooper in North Carolina, like John Ossoff or Raphael Warnock in Georgia. I don't know if Pete Buttigieg has that in the 2028 cycle. Now, it hasn't been tested, and this is something that's just strictly based off vibes. I don't know if this is going to be the case. I do think, though, coming off a cycle where you're seeing that J.D. Vance and Donald Trump on the same ticket won North Carolina by 3.5 points. They won Georgia by roughly 2 points. I think Georgia, being the state that did, see the least amount of resistance based on the national shift, probably would narrowly go to Pete Buttigieg. But for North Carolina, I'd still err on the side of caution for Democrats there. It's been a state they haven't been able to win since 2008. They hadn't won it before then since 1976. So North Carolina, until proven otherwise, I think 2026 will be a good moment for that for Democrats to see really if it is this state that is just so hard to achieve but can be achieved rather than a state that just is so hard to achieve and still can't be achieved. We'll see if that happens. North Carolina for now, I think lies in the J.D. Vance column. Georgia, though, I think lies in the Pete Buttigieg column. And so I do think that, Buttigieg's main core strength and constituency primarily relies in these already Democratic states, as well as the Rust Belt. But I could see Georgia going there either. I think, Michigan was a state in the last cycle. If you take a look at the presidential election results, might be shocking, right? But Michigan and Georgia, not too far off from each other. Pennsylvania and Georgia, not too far off from each other. And so I do think that makes a lot more sense that these are states that vote together in 2028 rather than separately. So, final prediction here, final electoral map. 286 electoral votes for Pete Buttigieg, 252 for J.D. Vance. A very close race, very competitive one. I do think where we are right now with the disapproval on Donald Trump, with the disapproval on J.D. Vance, and again, this searching around, soul-searching in the Democratic Party for a nominee that could be able to win back voters, win elections in the future. I think right now, in this hypothetical, Pete Buttigieg stands to serve that purpose. I think it will be interesting to see how he decides to run, if he decides to run, what it looks like in 2028. Because as of right now, it's going to be a very, very competitive race. Nobody's going to have it as easy as they think. And 2028 will be a very, very fun race to watch from the outside perspective with an open Democratic primary, with an open Republican primary. 2028, certainly a race that will be very, very fun. I've said that a lot of times. I mean it. We have 3 years to cover it, 3 years to talk about it, and it'll start ramping up probably later this year. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2028 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.